Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope everyone's getting back from their break and ready for a lively discussion. My name is Amber Bales. I am the co-chair of Education and Programming. I work here at Miami University of Ohio. And we have three panelists today. I will let them introduce themselves here in just a minute. If you've noticed in the chat, Heather Galloway is dealing with an internet outage that just occurred, so she might not be able to join with video. So we'll bear through that project. I have about 5 questions that have been crowdsourced as we plan for this event, but I encourage everyone to put their questions into the chat. Rachel Makarowski will be monitoring that, and we'll interject those as needed. And I also encourage you to kind of think about this as an informal discussion. If you have follow-up questions as we're going through, please put those in the chat or raise your hand. And so without any further ado, I will begin introductions. Do we want to start with Sarah? And then we'll go over to Laura Moeller and Heather Galloway. And while they're doing their introductions, I'll put their official bios in the chat so that you can look at this. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Amber. Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be with you today. Thanks so much for asking me, Amber and Rachel. Again, my name is Sarah Scaturro. I'm the Chief Conservator at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I am actually a fashion and textile conservator, and so the preservation of books and paper is not totally an area I'm super knowledgeable about, although now you can say I'm responsible for at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I previously was the conservator at the head conservator at the Costume Institute, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I'm also a PhD student at Bard Graduate Center, and I am getting my doctoral degree in the history of design, decorative arts, and material culture studies. And my dissertation is focusing on the history of costume conservation in the US and Britain during the 20th century. So that's a bit about me.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me for this. I'm flattered to be on the panel. Again, my name is Laura Moeller, and I'm in private practice at Strange Duck Art Conservation in Covington, Kentucky. I've been in Kentucky for about 5 years. I was recently the conservator for the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco. I treat photographic materials and works on paper and serve a client base of institutions and individuals. I'll just say too, when I was reviewing the questions, which were great questions, thank you group, that I'm sure that we can all appreciate this, that it is there. My answers are not intending to be vague necessarily, but I feel like as a conservator, there's a lot of possibly, maybe, it depends on the situation, or like the science says, but in practice this. So that is my disclaimer for a lot of my answers.
So my name's Heather Galloway, and I apologize that I am faceless here, but I am smiling at you. I am a conservator in private practice. I work on paintings and painted surfaces. I have been teaching, I don't know how many years now, to allied professionals, art historians, about conservation and conservation-based classes, looking at ethics, in fact, and I am currently serving on a subcommittee for the American Institute of Conservation, because we are actually in the process of trying to rewrite our code of ethics. So when the crowdsourced document was shared, I suggested to Rachel and Amber that one of the things that I'm interested in about, rather than looking for whether I approve or not approve, is what you would hope for as information that you would want in a conservator's code of ethics. Because we are in this process, we are trying to share authority, welcome more voices in, which means, much as Laura is saying, that we don't always and can't always give definitive answers. So I'm looking forward to the discussions. It's timely for me at the moment.
Great. Thank you all for those great bios. So let's get going with the first question. What advice or thoughts do you have about balancing access and use of materials with preservation, especially at libraries whose situations are not as ideal as a museum? The writer here put, for example, exhibiting and displaying of materials without the institutional funding to properly filter UV from windows, displaying books in severe conditions before they can be prioritized for treatment, etc. Anyone want to go first on answering that question? It always seems like everyone jumps in all at once after a pause.
I can go, and only because I'm not in a library. And so when I first saw this, I was like, I don't know if I really have anything to offer it. But then as I'm sitting here thinking, at the Costume Institute, I don't know if any of you have been to any of these exhibitions, but they're like utterly insane. And the stuff that I was asked to do was pretty challenging. So these are actual museum objects, and me being asked to put them in 1,000, 2,000 foot candle light or certain things like that. And so there were times where, within the reporting structure, I was unable to say no. I had to just do it. And I always took that opportunity to gather data. So when situations were happening that were not so ideal, that I didn't really love, and yet I thought in my mind and in the code of ethics that I follow, which is AIC's code of ethics, aren't really allowed necessarily. I just thought, well, all I can do is gather data, so the next time this happens, I will have that data, I can show how damage happened, and I can present that. And sure enough, that actually seemed to work for me for a few instances. One would be they wanted to show all these feathered garments out in the open. We have, hundreds of thousands of visitors, the amount of dust and insects going on them. And so I had actually collected dust from my regular vacuumings of other garments to show them. And I brought them to the meeting and opened up this really disgusting package of dust from our weekly vacuumings. And that enough was, that was enough to enable the curator to be like, you know what, yeah, let's put these behind a vitrine. So I don't know if that's really speaking to ethics, but just kind of more of a how can we get what we think we want when we have to play in a collaborative and cooperative way.
I would agree completely with Sarah that sometimes I also do not work in a library or a public institution, and I would say that so much that I end up being then charged with in those kinds of situations is that kind of documentation to then have essentially that record to show people kind of moving forward how to make kind of different decisions. I think there's also a lot of considerations in the question about what does access actually look like? Is that viewing an object? Is that actual physical interaction with that? I think a lot of this comes down also to staffing and kind of how many people actually you have to monitor said pieces. Is this going to be an object in an exhibition, or is this something that is going to be paged and then a researcher can be handling? Again, yeah, documentation of just that record. And sometimes I think it's kind of it becomes our responsibility of how many people can you actually speak to on a staff, and kind of who then gets to make the decision. For a recent exhibition in the Cincinnati area, I feel very fortunate that I was able to actually have a series of discussions with the staff members on the display of autochromes, and that I was advising against that because of how the display was to be constructed and having kind of constant light levels for this piece. And they graciously, took those considerations seriously and actually created a facsimile and wall text to to correlate with the piece and explaining why a facsimile was actually used and kind of the sensitivity of these photographic materials. So it was a win. Yeah, but again, those are really great points by Sarah.
So I just want to add, as somebody who teaches as well to students who are interested in object-based learning, and I both work with Sarah Scaturro's department in order to give them access to museum objects, and I also work with Andrew Mancuso, who's here today, to get access within a library setting. And I just want to applaud the library environment in giving access. I'm married to a professor of art history at Oberlin College, and he and I talk about this often, that a library is an access to actual objects. And I appreciate that there are times you may feel stressed and that you are making compromises, but it is so valuable what you do. And there are obviously moments where there's going to be a drop dead. You can't hear, this isn't facsimile, whatever the case may be. But from my perspective in dealing mostly with fine arts, museum-based objects, you're our heroes. We want you out there and working with us and trying to get access for people, because there's another question here about, the value of that object once it's been scanned. And if we are really behind object-based teaching, holding a book and moving it and flexing its binding is different and gives a lot of value to people and students for appreciating that, the engineering. So I think we have to keep going, and we have to make compromises at times.
Thank you for that. Well, and the follow-up question to that is going to really discuss access and what Heather just discussed. What are your thoughts on the concept that once something has been digitized and placed online, that patrons will no longer have a need to see the object in person?
So I'll just kind of piggyback on what Heather was saying about, those kinds of considerations about, once an object is digitized, what value are we getting from that, teaching from the actual object. I was recently at the Photographic Materials Group AIC meeting in Austin, and one of my colleagues, Jessica Keister, was actually presenting on a treatment to the New York Public Library's treatment of Anna Atkins' British algae. And while they were discussing that, the book had actually received pretty substantial digitization efforts in the past, and were just exceptional images for the majority of the public to actually interact with, that there would still be cases of scholars and researchers needing to actually examine the object in person, especially because the binding structure is somewhat of an anomaly. And so again, there will always be cases of that, I think the digitization of objects will certainly reduce, the amount of individuals actually needing to handle these pieces. But again, like Heather was saying, the teaching from the object, the handling of that, or just the interaction with those objects in some way, in some physical way, will always be present. And, that is also part of our profession, which, I'm completely behind.
Do we want to ask a question or answer a question, or should I continue? Sorry. I know Chatham has a question. I didn't.
Chatham, do you want to go ahead and ask?
It was a quick comment.
Yes.
Paul Duguid used to do a bit on an Italian archive with documents that were soaked in vinegar because of an outbreak of disease in the city. And you'd have all the letters that would say, everything is wonderful here. And then you'd have the Joe Isuzu moment where you would smell the document, and if it smelled a little bit like vinegar, you knew they were lying.
How interesting. How do you top that? Just to go to the about digitization. So CMA, we're going for like 100% collection online. So we do have a lot of information online, but you're correct. There is nothing like being able to hold an object in your hand. So we do actually have an education art collection, and that is something that I think a lot of institutions do. Is they kind of have tiers of collections, right? They have the collection that is maybe the hands-off collection, or that only a specialist get to work with. And then they have this other tier of collection that provides more access to students and the public. And then we also want to think about even conservation students themselves and learning how to conduct treatments on objects and, being thrown in. And yes, they're real objects, but maybe they're kind of like a lower stake object that comes from a study collection that has this kind of reassurance that, if you mess up, it's not the end of the world. It's nothing that's super priceless. So that's kind of me just bringing in a larger objects overview to that.
So from speaking also like on the level of education, I have seen my students use the amazing documentation at the Cleveland Museum of Art's website. And I will suggest that the high-res images that they have are pretty close to what a microscope can do. Cameras also see things differently than the human eye, so I find them a both-and tool rather than a replacement. And I encourage my students to take their computers in front of the objects that they're examining, because these two things can really help each other. So if there's this idea that one might be, or the fear that one might be a replacement, we just get more toys in the end, the original and the files. And again, my husband teaching book studies right now at Oberlin College, the amount of digitization that is online right now is just a boon to his teaching and not a replacement for the object.
As someone who works with digital collections, that's great to hear, Heather. I love the term. I wrote it down, both and. Yes, we need both and. So moving on to the next question. This question, she writes, I'm really interested if any of the panelists have encountered situations when they might consider the artist's intent or interest around longevity of their work with regards to conservation. Artists that may have expressed opinions around auto-destruction, natural aging, etc. Are there times that they may opt to not conserve something in order to honor the artist's wishes around their work? I'll let whoever's ready to jump in. I see Laura is nodding her head. Do you want to go for it?
Well, I wrote down a very lengthy answer to this question. It's, how complicated. So I'm going to kind of be looking down because I wanted to make some specific points. There's a lot of considerations about, is this artist living or not? And there are complications for that either way. And also, did the conservator get to have a conversation directly with the artist, or is this coming from a director, a curator, a registrar? I think that a lot has been written about this for the conservation of kinesthetic objects and pieces that are more ephemeral, ethereal, things that have organic material, including like bodily fluids and foodstuffs. Anecdotally, I mean, I encounter objects where there's a lot of speculation about what the artist did intend. And again, I think it kind of depends on who's doing the asking. Is it, maybe an overzealous collector or curator? I'm sorry for the woofing in the background. My dog is woofing. But I've kind of lost my place. And again, I think it's this constant lifelong learning that we're charged with, of knowing how to say no, and how that changes over the years. And, would we make different decisions about a treatment in 5, 10, 20 years? I'll say that I remember specifically a retrospective for an institution that I was working for, and the condition of the artwork was very, very bad, and the artist was living and stated that they wanted it as is, and kind of no interventions, because it really showed kind of the life of the work, how it was stored, kind of the conditions of their own life. And then once the actual show was installed, and even during the installation, the wall text was changed to again, like, comment on the condition of things. And then the artist changed their mind and saw that, like, how the pieces kind of looked in this very kind of like sterile environment, changed their mind, and then wanted conservation treatment. So again, it's like, it's both. And yeah, I'm very excited to hear my my peers' thoughts on this.
I think that's so interesting that you brought up the idea of the artist changing their mind, Laura, because I think it is often a question that hasn't, this is a sort of a philosophical question, as if there are strong statements about an artist saying, just let it go. In that case, if the statement has been made that strongly, then people like Laura, Sarah, and I aren't actually going to see the objects, right? They're not coming to us for intervention if their wishes are being respected. I think more of my experience is sort of twofold, where the artist is disappointed in the way that something has aged, and they don't like the results, and they often push the boundaries of, let's say, the AIC code of ethics, because they want their object made whole in a different way, visually whole in a different way. So I feel like I come across that sort of situation more than the previous one, where an artist has been clear, or a maker has been clear, no, do not resuscitate. In the instance where it is sort of do not resuscitate, I do think conservation is willing to stand by and let that happen. There's lots of places where we don't intervene. Some of that is because there's no intervention that can make it right. So there's the limitations of the object itself, as opposed to what our ethics do and do not say.
Yeah, amazing, brilliant statements by my co-panelists. I agree wholeheartedly. I had actually written the artist changing their mind in my response to this question too, because I've encountered this where working with a fashion designer who wanted an incredibly high amount of light level on her pieces in an exhibition. And then as I actually was doing the exhibition walkthrough, they ended up saying, oh, they wanted lower light levels because they didn't want to, you know, impact their pieces, is one of them. Or I think the thing, again, I go back to fashion because that's my area. Fashion is an ephemeral cultural product. It's meant to change. It's got novelty. It's never meant to last. And so a lot of fashion designers, once they birth it and create it out into the world, they don't actually want anything to do with it anymore. And so they don't really care if something were to happen. Now, the thing that is changing from an industry standpoint is that some of the larger fashion companies are starting to want these things because they're used as brand DNA and marketing and whatever. And so I think, you know, fashion is its own unique process because it's a design object, it's a functional object as much as it's an art object. And I think I'm veering off the rails, so I'm gonna rein myself in right there and see that Jamie has her hand open.
Yeah, before Jamie steps in, I was noticing that Walter just mentioned Anselm Kiefer from their MA work, and this is where the question comes from. And I have actually worked on Anselm Kiefer. And again, this is an artist who both sort of has this idea of transmutation of materials, like this sort of going through the fire. And yet I know for a fact in the discussions that we had with his studio assistant, things like that, before an exhibition, there'll be bits of lead swept up, you know, to move them away that have fallen off, but not everything that falls off is left off. There's like a level. When that ski fell off of somebody's painting, that's when he wanted it back on. So again, artists are just as fickle as the way as any of us.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention two indigenous objects, because there are a lot of objects that are not supposed to be conserved in indigenous contexts. And so it's not just artists that we're thinking about or that we're dealing with when we're talking about whether we should conserve something. It's also can be cultural, and we may not have an artist per se that we're talking to, but it may be a representative of a native nation or something like that. So that might be an object that could be in an archive that you could encounter, this audience might encounter more so than an art object. But some of those questions are important to remember in that context as well.
Yeah, what a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. I think, also, so for so long, it's like there's this idea that this field is neutral. And that's like, we shouldn't have an opinion. But it is important, especially, just with a consideration that Jamie just brought up about a cultural representative or an artist or, a living heir, or like, who are the people who are actually like helping make a decision? Because I think sometimes that can be even more problematic is not making a decision and just kind of like wait and see. So again, a balance.
Thank you all. Those are great points. The next question we have is, at public institutions, we sometimes accept donations with a gift agreement. Many years later, we realize it's difficult to upkeep some of these agreements while also upholding preservation standards. What advice would you give to an institution with requirements to display materials permanently, especially in institutions that cannot meet preservation standards for light levels?
Well, I think the ideal would be change the agreements, I think maybe kind of first, the ideal would be to be able to actually change the verbiage in a collections management policy. Then if that's not possible, possibly amending the gift agreements. And then if that's not possible, adding essentially a very thorough limitation section, kind of much like Sarah was talking about, the documentation and kind of like showing like what has happened, but really laying out, okay, well, these are the risks if this is something that's intended to have this on permanent display. And kind of what exactly does permanent display look like? And I mean, you never know, maybe there could be a possibility with having that kind of language added to contracts and, really putting things in black and white that possibly some of the people, generously giving gifts might also kick in some kind of a financial gift to actually support the continued, stewardship of their gift.
Sarah or Heather, do you have anything to add there before we move on?
Yeah, I don't know that I do. I mean, I think Laura has some really good points. I'm sure some of it would also depend. There are consequences, obviously, if you have delicate material to leave it on display all the time. And even us right now, we're looking at a code of ethics. These things they can't foresee the future, and they can't see how things are going to change. If you have circumstances that have changed, then you have to sort of advocate for the amendment of that document or the acceptance of the consequences. If it's one of 50 similar objects, maybe the consequences don't hurt as much, but you're going to be creating a living testament to what happens to permanent display. And there may be reasons for that. Like, is there a reason to always have that on display despite somebody might make an argument that's compelling because there's something else that they are trying to preserve in that object being there. So.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's every much a way forward by just accepting it and dealing with it. This idea of kind of like a sacrificial object if you've got others. I struggle with that with the tapestry displays in our armor court, because we have these beautiful tapestries that are just always there, and we don't have anything else, and that is what they are. I also want to just talk briefly about, and both Laura and Heather had mentioned this, about the idea of risk and risk assessments. You know, historically in conservation, we've tied our risk assessments to the loss of material, right? The change or the loss of material values. But what is starting to happen more and more in conservation is that we are now tying our risk assessments to perhaps a change in actual values, a different kind of values. Maybe it's a community level values, or whomever the constituents are, or a change in the meaning versus the actual change in the material appearance. And so I think that's where we need as a field to really be thoughtful, is consider what does this display of this object actually mean? What does this treatment of this object actually mean? And that helps inform what we do to it and how we advocate for certain steps we'll take. And I mean, this might sound pretty wishy-washy, or as Laura, you had prefaced saying, you know, it depends, but so much of what we do is context-based, and it is taking into account who these you know, communities are that really those objects belong to them, and that helps guide our decision just as much as the actual material state of the object does, or the risks to that material state of the object.
Thank you all. That was great points. So we have about 14 minutes left in this discussion. So this is kind of your friendly last call for questions. We have one more from the crowdsourced questions. I'll ask our panelists to keep it short if other questions are starting to come in, so that we can address some of the new questions. Rachel, do you have any questions? Are you seeing anything that I'm missing?
We do have one question in the chat.
Okay, so we'll I'll give this last question, which and then we'll try and tie it up with that last one. Just 1 minute. Okay, so this was a two-part question, so I know it's gonna be tough to keep it short. How do you make a decision to not intervene? What are the ethics of repairing versus not repairing? And they followed that up with, conservation is often too expensive for individuals or small organizations, perhaps a different ethical quandary. What are inexpensive, effective interventions that can be a good stopgap measure? So go from there.
So I really appreciated this question, because being in private practice, you are approached by people of all different means. And this is painting base related, but I recently had somebody come to me with a painting that had a tear that was emotionally valuable. I even knew the artist who had done it. Neither myself nor the ICA here in Cleveland could do this repair under the limitations that this person had, but I really wanted to see what would happen. And she kindly shared with me, she took it to a frame shop, and somebody repaired the painting for $120 for her. And she was gracious in sharing the images with me. She didn't want to at first. I wanted to know who had done it, because I want to be able to turn people to repairing something emotional for them where they cannot afford me. I think that is a valuable thing that we don't talk about. It is not a perfect repair, and the owner didn't care. She can see where the losses are. The person painted over with acrylic paint, which I will actually say over oil paints is totally reversible in a conservation world. So it was not a treatment by a conservator. I have no idea if there's a piece of masking tape on the back, but this person's emotional bond was made whole in a way that I could not do. And I think that is appropriate.
Yeah, what a great point, Heather. Yeah, I mean, again, it's all risk versus reward. I mean, I'm photographic materials and works on paper. So a lot of times with private clients, if the actual, recommended treatment and limitations are beyond what they would like to invest, the recommendations for facsimiles are made, and actually properly storing the original, because then, if something is in, a Mylar sleeve, is in a proper box, there can be considerations for, pursuing that treatment at a later time. I feel like this is such a tired expression, but that like the Sears catalog, kind of good, better, best, it's just like there's lots of options, and it can't all be Cadillac because it doesn't fit, every need, every budget, every reason. So great points, Heather.
Yeah, definitely. Good, better, best is great. So having tiers of options is always a great approach. I would say, I'm deep, in my PhD research about textile conservation and costume conservation. And one thing that has really come out of this is that a lot of our practices that we use just come out of sensible housekeeping methods. And just mending your clothes, and there's this whole mending revolution, repair revolution happening, and so as much as I don't want to say you can repair it yourself, there actually are simple repairs that people could probably do by themselves, or have a good seamstress do, or have somebody do. And then in terms of storage, it's housekeeping is really what a lot of it is.
Great. Rachel, do you want to share the last question?
Absolutely. So Chatham asked in the chat, lately there have been some discussions about material safety that seem to have an ethical dimension. I'm thinking of projects like the Poison Book Project, where the process of conservation and collection management, as it might relate to something like exposure to toxic chemicals during work, could raise both ethical and legal concerns for conservators. The practice and safety sections of the AIC Code Online address these issues. Has there been any discussion of whether a code of ethics should say more?
Yes, right now it is going on. And in fact, the subgroup of the AIC Code of Ethics that I am serving on is professional sustainability. And we are working on language right now for health and safety that makes it clear that we need to value our health and safety. And that has to be an ethical priority. Yeah.
There are also issues with restitution and how a lot of, say, indigenous materials might have pesticides that were applied to them earlier in their museum lives, and how do you ethically address the removal of these materials if you can before any items are restituted.
This comes up for me with dangerous materials frequently with nitrate films. And I still think that institutions are constantly grappling with what do we do with these massive archives of still and motion picture nitrate film. And there's I don't know. There's a lot of different opinions on it. I think it depends on the size of these collections. And again, it all comes down to use. But I'm very heartened to know that the AIC is going to be revising as far as like health and safety for conservators go, because I think we've probably all encountered very dangerous materials and would like to find better ways to do that safely.
Thank you so much for answering that question. It looks like we don't have any further questions in the chat, but Heather, since you're working on the AIC ethics documents and policies as we speak, is there any questions that you'd like to ask the group?
Well, once again, I am curious for many of you who may be using conservation services as opposed to being a conservator. I know we're a mixed crowd. I feel like early iterations of the Code of Ethics were very much about making sure that we were not making Rembrandts when nobody was looking, or damaging your objects and not explaining them to you. What would you like to see in the AIC Code of Ethics other than a reminder that we we all need to take care of our own health and those who are working around us.
Is there anyone that would like to weigh in on that question? Sarah and Laura, you're more than welcome to as well, of course.
Well, one thing, I don't know if this really answers this question, Heather, but I think a lot of you probably heard about, you know, Kim Kardashian and Marilyn Monroe's dress at the Met Gala. Maybe some of you did. If you didn't, that really kind of created a lot of chatter amongst textile conservators and fashion curators, and that's led me to actually think about there's this kind of code of ethics or guidelines that was used in the fashion conservation, textile conservation, and curation world. That was all about you shall not wear clothes in collections. And not that the AIC Code of Ethics would specifically say this, but I think what I'm really hopeful that'll be in the AIC Code of Ethics, and I think is going to be there, is this kind of more, as Jonathan Ashley Smith would say, bespoke code of ethics, where actually there are instances where we might want to have people wear clothes in collections. And again, I'm thinking more about those communities for whom their cultural heritage was stolen or unethically acquired. And so I'm just really hopeful that this new code of ethics allows a kind of flexibility and a measured kind of assessment of what really matters here. Like, why are we actually preserving this material, and for whom does this material have meaning?
Thanks, Sarah. I think the many committees and subcommittees in this whole process of rewriting the Code of Ethics, which is very challenging, but I think the initial impetus to actually rewrite the Code of Ethics was because of points that you raised or that Jamie has raised about extending community use and sort of what we considered bending the rules. We realized that the rules were too much and did not allow flexibility. And so, but it's very hard getting a group of people together. They start to put rules down, but we're working on it. And I'm taking you all as inspiration for my next meeting, that I have to hold fast, that we should not give a shopping list of our favorite, you know, bugaboos, that it needs to be flexible to allow creative thinking amongst groups, because we need to trust each other.
So well put. The trust is the word I was thinking of, and kind of this opening up the dialogue and kind of, I don't know, kind of like removing the curtain a little bit, and like kind of, it's not this very upstairs downstairs relationship, and trusting the people who are actually using these objects to know how they want to and need to, and how their communities kind of dictate that. So important.
We do also have a comment in the chat that from Miriam that says that she agrees and that she would love to see an acknowledgement of the power exercised in making decisions and moving away from the assumption that best practice is inherently ethical. Unless anyone has any further comments at this time, I think that we can go ahead and say happy 2 minutes back on to your Fridays. Thank you, Laura, Sarah, and Heather, so much for sharing your perspectives today. I know that I got a lot out, and it looks like very many people in the chat agree with that. So have a fantastic Friday, everyone, and a good weekend. And you should get the notification of a recording in the next couple of weeks.
Everyone knows now that Rachel doesn't have to work tomorrow. It's Thursday. Have a great
Oh my God.
Thursday, everyone.
Yeah, this is what happens when you work too many 12-hour days.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.